Hi, welcome to the Two Nobodies podcast. I'm your host, Rupesh Patel. This episode that you're about to listen to is why I do what I do when it comes to hosting this podcast. I just had the most wholesome conversation with Prakash Diar, a human rights lawyer, human rights advocate who now lives here in Canada. And we talk about systemic racism in Canada. We talk about individual racism. We talk about how diversity, equity, and inclusion training, where it's landing well and where it's falling short, what we should expect from our political leaders. How do we move forward on this issue? We also talk about his past in South Africa and how what it was like to live during the apartheid period, to one of his most famous cases that he defended six people in, known as the Sharpeville Six. We finally end the conversation on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and get his thoughts on what's happening right now with South Africa and then putting something into the International Court of Justice. It's a fascinating conversation, and I hope you'll listen to it and stay tuned and enjoy it.
Welcome to the Two Nobodies podcast with my dad.
Prakash, it's so nice to see you, my friend. Thank you for making time and join the Two Nobodies podcast today.
Oh, no, thank you, Rupesh, for the invitation. And I'm definitely a nobody, so that makes two of us.
It's really, I was telling my wife this morning, I was like, I'm a bit anxious, I'm not going to lie, because your story, which I want to get into, and just your background and your commitment to human rights, it truly is an honor for me to be able to speak to you today and to talk about, a number of topics, whether it be systemic racism in Canada, whether it be, your time in South Africa and some of the important proceedings that you were a part of, to even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So just to be able to tap into your brain and be curious with you for the next, 90 minutes or so, it truly is an honor. So thank you, really.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure, and don't forget, I'm just sharing my experiences, but I truly consider myself as a nobody, but happy to share my experiences.
Thank you. You have an interesting story. Like I know we've talked about this offline. When we think about systemic racism in Canada, like what brought you to really continue your work from South Africa into Canada, continue this kind of focus on human rights? Like you had such a interesting journey in the past, but like you could have easily just been like, you know what, I had my time, I did a lot of work there, but I want to continue this fight. Like it's so amazing that you
Yeah.
continue to pursue this work.
Yeah, it's a long story and a long answer perhaps, but I'll try and summarize it for you. And maybe we'll get back into it a little later and some of your other questions. But as you know, I was born and raised in South Africa, of Indian ancestry, third generation, blah blah blah. I was involved in a lot of human rights cases, and for my own personal safety, I had to, of course, leave the country. And when I came to Canada, I had to requalify as a lawyer. Although I had practiced for about 7 years in South Africa, I had to requalify here.
Mm,
And so I went to law school at Ottawa U at the law faculty, common law faculty. And while I was in class, in one of the classes, my professor, who also taught legal clinical, the legal clinical aid, or I'm saying it the other way around, legal aid clinic
clinic.
that he
Yep.
ran. Yeah, yeah. And he had somebody who wanted assistance, and this person's name was Dr. Chunda Grover.
Mm,
And Dr. Grover was a highly qualified scientist with a PhD and very impressive fellow working at the National Research National Research Center, I believe it was called NRC.
mm,
Yeah. And he had a complaint of discrimination against his employer on the basis of race. And my professor, whose name was David Bennett, by the way,
mm.
Professor Bennett, knew I had experience as a litigator, and he asked me to join him as a co-counsel. And I had arrived in '89, and I think this case started in 1990. So it
Okay.
was soon, while I was requalifying, I became involved in the human rights complaint of Dr. Grover. And of course, it was right up my alley, so to say. And it wasn't difficult, to, but it made me realize that, I've come from one system of oppression in a very different way, and
Mm.
I was coming here to Canada, and they have issues which are different, of course, than what I was used to.
Yeah.
But there was an allegation here, and a very credible one. And of course, at the end of the day, we proved, which was very difficult in the Canadian way to prove uh, discrimination, because it is practiced in such a subtle and sophisticated way in
Mm.
which I was not used to. So that, and then I got, requalified, of course, and I got many other cases of note. I won't mention all of them, but they invariably had to do with racial discrimination.
Hmm.
I'll just mention one more, Dr. Shiv Chopra, who was a wonderful, bright, doctor as well. Uh, and then I did his case. Yeah, we succeeded in his case as well. And then we had a bunch of complaints coming. My first job, by the way, when I requalified, because I was exposed in the Dr. Grover case with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, I was very fortunate to get a job as legal counsel at the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
Okay. Yeah.
And so while at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, I had a lot of these cases coming up. And then through Dr. Shiv Chopra, who was the principal driver of this case, we found that there were so many cases against the government of Canada on systemic racial discrimination allegations that we had a sort of a quote unquote a class action by a major organization called the National Capital Alliance on Race Relations.
Mm.
The acronym was NCAR, NCARR,
Hmm.
where the central allegation NCAR was making was that the government of Canada was discriminating in the federal public service of what they call quote unquote visible minorities
Mm.
from moving into senior management positions. And it was a lengthy trial, and it was like a over 45 day trial. And at the end of the day, we won a very successful order proving that, as difficult it was in terms of evidentiary burden of proving discrimination, because it's practiced in such a subtle and sophisticated way. We got a really big order. So that's what really brought me in to practice, in the human rights area. And then thereafter, I got exposed, of course, to indigenous issues,
Yeah.
which I didn't know too much about. And then, so the transition for me was sort of almost natural, coming from South Africa. And yeah, I could have taken another path. I articled actually with a criminal law firm, a wonderful, one of the most senior litigators in criminal law.
Hmm.
I articled with him, but I had enough of criminal law, so I said no, I don't want to practice criminal law
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
I'm going to rather focus on human rights.
Yeah. What drove you, like, in terms of, like, yeah, what kept you engaged when you were in South Africa, and does that still remain true now? Like, what makes you tick, Prakash?
I think at the end of the day, it's justice, right? Truth and
Mm.
justice, the rule of law. I think if I could summarize it that way, I think that's what drives me or ticks me.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, uh, I mean, many countries, including Canada, we know talk about democracy and the rule of law,
Yep.
but to what extent do we really practice that? Or I mean, can we improve even if we are practicing some of that? But we should be practicing that, not all some of the time, all of the time, right?
Mhm.
Because the rule of law, in my view, should be applied equally to everyone, no matter who the litigants are, before the parties, or
Yeah.
which countries, for that matter. If you're talking in the international arena of international human rights, so I think the rule of law is important to me. Humanitarian law is important to me. Human rights is important to me. I guess because I grew up in a system of oppression
Mhm.
where we were not even given the right to vote. I mean, when I say we, I'm talking about anybody who was not white,
Sure.
and only whites were like less than 10% of the population.
Mhm.
And so they had all the power and all the privilege. Uh, I guess growing up in that environment, gave me a sense of justice that was not right, And when I came to Canada and I learned more about Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples and the colonization, and how Indigenous peoples have not really been treated well in the legal system. I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, as a lawyer, I try to find, as lawyers and as a litigator, it's based on facts and law, right? And context. And so that's I think what makes me question certain things some of the times.
You would think
Um,
that. Go ahead, Prakash.
yeah, no. I just said, no. I hope I answered your question. But yeah. So to me, it really doesn't matter who the offender or who the perpetrator is.
Mm,
I think in order to be credible, in order not to be a hypocrite, one needs to be consistent in the rule of law, in the application of the law, no matter who the offender may be. We shouldn't make exceptions for some and not others, because then you lose all credibility.
yeah. You bring a great point, and actually, I was going to say, like, you would think that trying to understand the underlying injustices in a system is something that would bring everybody together, but it seems like
Hmm.
nowadays, and I don't know how prevalent this conversation is, but you see it come up with really, mainstream people, of how people something about talking around systemic racism or racism
Hmm.
in a country or in a system irks people. Like it bothers
Yeah.
people, and I don't always understand why, because of the way you just framed it. Like, we should all be trying to understand. We should all try to understand what the different injustices are, regardless of the color of your skin or whoever it is. Right? We should all be on board with that. But as soon as we start talking about there's systemic racism in a country or systemic racism in a system, or whatever it might be, it's starting to irk people. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And well, let's back up, and I'll try and answer it as best as I can. Systemic racism is also known as institutional racism,
Hmm.
right? Essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, it refers to the ways that whiteness and white superiority becomes embedded in the policies and the practices of an institution, right? Resulting in systemic, I would say, that advantages white people and disadvantages indigenous peoples, people of color,
Hmm.
notably either in employment, in education, in the justice system, in the
Hmm.
health system, and in society generally, right? So in a country like Canada, which is a colonial state, colonial country, systemic racism, I think, is deeply rooted in every systems of this country. This means that systems were put in place or designed many decades ago to benefit white colonists, while disadvantaging indigenous peoples
Hmm.
who had lived here, prior to colonization, right? So this power dynamic continues to be upheld and reinforced in our society, extending,
Hmm.
to its impact on the law and how people are treated. Now, I must say that, although this is not about me, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my
Absolutely.
experience, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I think, there are. I've experienced, myself some racism. But before I talk about that, I think, to answer your question, if I, got it properly, why people react the way they are, uh, I think, uh, you know, I think it's got to do with people not really sometimes I'm saying, aware of what's happening.
Mm,
And people grow up in different parts of their lives. Most people grow up in a bubble. I mean, just look at our history of indigenous peoples.
mhm.
That was never taught in school. I mean, I'm
No.
talking about the true history. of
Yep.
indigenous people, never taught in school, right?
No.
Just a case in point, the colonization, including Indian residential schools and slavery as well.
Yep.
So there's a lot of there is a lot of what I call sometimes white supremacy. That sometimes individuals don't even realize it. uh, so the white privilege protects people from experiencing what indigenous peoples experience or black and brown people experience.
Mm.
And so sometimes they are triggered because they think they are being attacked,
Mm.
they're being named or they're being shamed. And
Mm-hmm.
that is never the intention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to speak truth to power
Mm.
if we want to change things. So for the most part, from my own personal experience, people are good, and when they are educated about the injustice, about the true facts or the true history, then they can see the wrong, and they can recognize it, right?
Mm.
There's a quote by it's the culture you grow up in, right? That's what I'm trying to say. That's why
Mm-hmm.
people react the way that they react. There's a sociologist. He passed away not too long ago. A person from Holland. His name was Gert Hofstadter.
Okay.
And he said this is how he described culture. Simply said, culture is how you were raised.
Mm.
It developed while you grew up.
Mm.
With a computer metaphor, culture is the software of the mind, right? Uh,
I like
so,
that. Yeah.
so I mean, so when you think about it, uh, just recently we had the tragic case of Joyce Eshagwan, who in Quebec, while she was dying, she was doing a live feed of how the nurses were treating her, and she was not treated well, as everybody knows, you know, and of course statements by people like the premier of Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
Premier Legault, say no, there's no systemic racism,
Mm-hmm.
or the former commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Leckie, did not understand what systemic racism is. She had
Mm.
to be educated about that. So sometimes people are surprised or even shocked when I tell them about my racial profiling.
Mm.
And how I and a fellow black colleague, whenever I used to work with the Department of Justice, just recently, just before the pandemic,
Yeah.
we were racially profiled at the Calgary airport,
Wow.
by the RCMP, So people are shocked when you tell them these things, So because that's not their lived experience, right?
Right.
I'm talking about generally white people.
Yep.
That's why I think they react the way they do.
Do you think there's this conflation then with like their own individual self and individual racism with systemic racism? Like there is true institutional systemic racism that's happening, but people look within themselves and are like, well, I'm not, I'm not racist. I don't express any racist tendencies. So this doesn't make sense to me. Do you think there's that conflation or mixing up that's happening?
I think you're absolutely right, Rupesh. Uh, there's a lack of understanding of what racism is, what
Hmm.
institutional racism is. But after all, institutional racism is made up by individuals, right?
Yep. Yep.
Those institutions are built by individuals. So,
Yep.
so yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a history, right? The history of colonization, the history of slavery, and in Canada in particular. I mean, Dr. What was the name? Racial Sellers, Dr. Rachel Zellers. Yeah,
Mm.
she did wonderful research, about how entrenched in the institution, and in the hiring process, in particular of the federal public service. And she goes back and she traces, where black, brown, and indigenous people participated in the world wars, right?
Hmm.
But when those who were not white came back from the wars, they were discriminated against. Those who were not white, of course, they were not accommodated in terms of jobs or training. Only whites were. And she also gives more recent examples, like for example, women were treated unequally, in society, and including in the workspace. And so they tried to address treating women more equitably. And so what happens, and I'm talking about the 60s and 70s
Mm-hmm.
and maybe some to the 80s, women were promoted, significantly to try and bridge that gap. But you know what happened, Rupesh? Is only white women seem to have benefited from that. Not indigenous women, not black women, not brown
Mm-hmm.
women. A similar example she gave was, uh, French-speaking Canadians were also discriminated in the federal public service, for
Mm-hmm.
example. They were not treated equally and well,
Mm-hmm.
and so they had to address that, with the Languages Act and everything else. And so now you find a greater representation of people who are French-speaking. But again, interestingly enough, there are many black, brown, and indigenous people who are French speaking, but they have been excluded from the
Mm.
process. So those are institutions, but they were created
Yes.
by individuals. And here's the thing: although the law on the books, when you talk about the constitution, or you talk um, uh, you know uh, 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 you talk about human rights legislation across the provinces in the federal public service, it seems to be neutral, right, on
Mm-hmm.
the face of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the application of their policies and practices that results in where we are.
Right.
I talked to you earlier about the NCAR case in 1997, where we proved systemic discrimination against the government of Canada,
Mm-hmm.
as represented by Her Majesty at the time,
Yep.
the Treasury Board, and the Public Service. Now, that was about 27 years ago.
Yep.
Fast forward, almost 30 years ago, almost 3 decades now, we're back to square one, where we have a black class action against the government for racially treating people unequally based on their color,
Mm-hmm.
and there's very strong prima facie evidence of that.
Mm.
And just a few months ago, you have the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which is mandated to address these issues. They themselves were found by
Yeah.
to have discriminated against his own racialized employees. So anyway,
Those are that case in particular, that last one, I mean, those are the ones where you just, like, cringe, right? Because, at a time where people are having the faith in our democratic institutions, it feels like at an
yeah,
all-time low. When you hear, like, the Canadian Human Rights Commission
yeah,
is having these kind of, these issues, that really,
yeah,
reduces your faith quite a bit.
yeah, it does. But as we said, in our struggle in South Africa for freedom, the struggle
Mm,
continues.
mhm,
And it went on to say, victory is certain, but we don't know when that victory is, and that's why
yeah.
the struggle continues.
Yeah. You were talking about earlier, like, the case in Quebec and Premier Legault, or former RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lackey, and,
Mm.
just their lack of understanding or recognition about institutional systemic racism. When you see leaders like that, whether it be in Canada or any country, the United States, obviously, that comes out a lot. When you see these political leaders, or institutional leaders, almost fall short in that regard, what goes through your mind?
Well, we have our work cut out for us, and
Yeah.
we got to expose, educate, expose whatever it is, um, and some of it is deliberate,
Mhm.
but so how do you fight the system? I guess that's the
Right.
question, right?
Yeah.
you know um, Systemic racism is like it is a ripple effect, from years of racist and discriminatory practices. So as individuals, it is normal to feel discouraged and powerless sometimes.
Mhm.
But from being more mindful of the ways the systems work, to promoting social accountability, that one can take. So what do we do? I think we got to reflect firstly, accept. I think without accepting the truth and acknowledging the truth, I don't think you can move ahead. I'm
Mm.
talking about those who deny, right?
Yeah.
Because truth and reconciliation, that's how it goes, right? Both in South Africa, here in Canada, and other
Mhm.
parts of the world as well. So the truth comes before reconciliation. You
Hmm.
got to acknowledge the truth first, and if you
Yeah.
don't, then you're not getting out the gates, right? So accepting that racism lives within our society, I think, is an important first step, right? And so and then you got to go reflect on the different ways and there's an intersectional lens as well. I mean, I'm just summarizing in the best way I can, right? And so sometimes, can feel uncomfortable, but this, in speaking the truth, and you should feel uncomfortable, because like Senator Murray Sinclair, who was the commissioner of the
Hmm.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he said it well. Like, he said, if you're not if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not doing something right.
Mm.
Because people need to face these hard facts.
Yeah.
So, but so that sets a solid foundation, I think, to explore the complexities of discrimination. In my mind, I mean, I'll summarize this. I mean, you got to educate yourself, and
Hmm.
and you got to speak up as well. But the bottom line for me is there's got to be a political will. It's as simple as that. you know if you have the political will, you can make fundamental, transformational changes. uh, but that political will always seems to be lacking, and we are not in power, right?
The
Talk
political
about
will for what, Prakash?
for really addressing this head on,
Mm.
and let there be accountability, because that is lacking, right? um,
Hmm.
People get away with this all the time. Why? Because you can get away with it.
Yeah.
you know so that's why I'm talking about political will to really want to change things. I mean, you can talk about accountability, especially in the employment situation.
Hmm.
People, managers, line managers, senior managers, they say some terrible things, or not only say it but practice it, and there's no accountability. You
Yeah.
know, so
That's a really
you
great point.
know education is important. I give the
Yeah.
benefit of the doubt to everybody, that maybe they're not aware, and they may need to be aware. And in my humble opinion, I've met wonderful Canadians from the start, based in South Africa, Canadian officials at the embassy, high commission in South Africa, wonderful people. Came here to Canada, wonderful people. When they know the truth, I think their hearts are good. They want to do the right thing. And I'm
Hmm.
speaking generally, of course,
Hmm.
but that's my experience. The majority of them are really good people.
Hmm.
When I mean, for the longest time, people didn't understand the Indian residential schools or what really happened. And I did a lot of training at the Department of Justice. I trained over 2,000 people
Wow.
on reconciliation.
Yeah.
you know and one of the things we talked about, of course, was Indian residential schools, and I was doing this training together with my indigenous partners in this, and most people were shocked in what they were hearing and learning. And one of the things we quoted, my colleague, who helped deliver this part of the training, uh, she said, and she quoted, her name is Jennifer David, and Jennifer David quoted one of the commissioners. Uh, she said, and it just slips my mind, Marie Wilson. Marie Wilson.
Okay.
She said, because they in the search and for the Truth and Reconciliation report, they went to as many residential schools as they could. You know
Hmm.
what she said? She said, not every Indian residential schools had a playground, but everyone had a graveyard. Now, can you believe that the school having a graveyard? And this was before the discovery, in Kamloops,
Hmm. Hmm.
about 3 years ago.
Hmm.
And so people are becoming more conscious about this. They're becoming knowledgeable about this. And so, I always give people the benefit of the doubt. And Nelson Mandela, who's one of my heroes, of course, he's famously quoted as saying, education is the most powerful weapon
Hmm.
which you can use to change the world.
Hmm.
And of course, the other one is, going in line with that is, I have a huge poster in the entrance of my home of Mandela, and it says, uh, you know, um, it always seems impossible until it is done. there is no easy walk to freedom anywhere.
Mm.
So that's what I meant. Our struggle continues.
Education is a powerful tool. I mean, you were seeing more and more, whether it be private firms or definitely in the public service, this focus on diversity and inclusion training, all these sort of things. What do you think is working well with D&I training, and what do you think? Where do you think we're falling short with it? Because again,
Yeah,
similar to like when we talked about like in the mainstream, you're hearing noise around people's views on or critiques of like, oh, there's no systemic racism in my country, yada yada yada.
yeah,
Similarly, there is criticism now around D&I training and whether
yeah.
we've gone too far or whatever it might be. Where do you feel like we're falling short, and what do you think we're doing well when it comes to D&I training?
Yeah, good questions. Speak a lot. We can speak a lot about this, but I'll try and paraphrase it. Um, Let me start off by saying that there is very little difference being made in this space
Okay, like
because
you mean the impact of this
in the
work, or
impact, yeah,
okay,
in the
interesting.
impact of this
Yeah.
work,
Okay.
yeah, and I say this simply because most of it seems like window dressing, if I call it a window dressing, is performative, and companies and government departments, they uh, I don't think they are that serious about achieving real results. There's no real will. They will talk about it, they will not put enough resources into it, right? And they will not even have what I was just a few moments ago talking about, accountability
Hmm.
to give real effect to the changes, right? So the DEI space, I think, has a lot of work still to be done. I think, especially since the murder of George Floyd,
Hmm.
we more people became more conscious and aware, and I think not only that, I think more people were willing to stand up and be counted,
Hmm.
and raise their voice about injustice. Um, but already, you see people saying, "Well, we've done enough." Done enough for what? What are the results, right? I mean, if you have one or two token appointments at some levels, you haven't done anything really, in my view.
Hmm. Hmm.
You haven't reached critical mass, and that's what you need for the momentum, to continue. But if
A
you
critical mass
appoint
of
one
what, Prakash?
of representation, sorry,
I got it.
of
Okay.
people, yeah, of representation,
Okay.
you got to reflect the society in which the society is made up of, and we don't have that, right?
Mhm.
That's my point. And if you have this critical mass, I think you will have sufficient people turnover. And you know what? I mean, we're not asking for handouts as minorities. I would be willing at any time, any day of the week, on merit, be evaluate,
100%. Yep.
you know, and I mean, I mean, this whole question of merit is another topic, right,
Mm.
on its own. They have made exceptions where it suits them. Example, I talked about the people coming back from the army, world
Mhm.
wars. Talked about women.
Mhm.
Talked about French-speaking people. Something. The What Dr. Zellers is talking about, that is the merit principle, really, and how it's been amended and flexible in some cases. But true merit, I'm talking about true merit, any day of the week, uh, we are as smart as anybody else, and we are as hardworking as anybody else,
Mhm.
right? And so, but that is lacking. So I mean, you look at the United States, and some of that is now creeping into to Canada.
Mhm.
You see that people are banning. I mean, they're outlawing at institutions
Yes.
the teaching of true history of slavery, of colonization, and of oppression and discrimination, right? Not only in schools, in elementary schools or high schools, but even at
Yep.
universities, that is shocking, right? Uh, So, I mean, this whole anti woke movement, I mean, woke is just being alive and alert to the
To what the
issues
truths are. Yeah, yeah,
and the truth, yeah.
yeah,
And there's a problem with that. They say, no, you shouldn't be alive to these issues. We like the status quo.
yeah.
Let it go, because white supremacy is what we want to protect in the end of the
Right,
day. I mean,
right.
it's crazy.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
2020, I mean, this 2023, 2024 now, it boggles the mind. It absolutely boggles the mind.
It does.
But that's what we are up against.
Yeah. Do you know the comedian Trevor Noah? Have you
I
heard of him?
know of him.
He's
I know
he's a
him very well. I know him very well.
Do
He's
you?
South African, of
He
course.
is.
Yeah, I know him
Yeah.
very well. Yeah, yeah,
His I don't know
yeah,
if you've seen his recent Netflix special, but he talks about like just like all the cultural war talk in the United States, and he's like people from around the world, they view what's going on in North America or the United States, and they think you're crazy. They're like, no one's talking about this stuff. There's so much common ground between people. No one is talking about all these different differences and all these things that people want to highlight and peg people against each other. He's like, it's ridiculous. Like he does a really good job at making it into like a comedic segment, right? But like at the essence of
but
it,
the
he's like
message is yeah, the message is
100%.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. No, he's brilliant. Yeah, yeah. No, he's brilliant, and so are many others like him. But yeah, it's crazy. I mean, how people can tolerate this, and just, I mean, we're talking about governors or equivalent of our premiers, and yeah, it just
presidential
boggles my mind.
candidates, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you want people to know about what's going on in Canada that you think would surprise them? Like you talked a little bit about certainly at the public service level, but like, what do you think people just don't quite understand that you want people to really understand of things that are happening when it comes to systemic racism in this country?
Yeah, I think top of my mind would be, the most pressing issue, in my humble opinion, is the question of Indigenous peoples and their
Mm,
rights. And I say that because there's a whole Truth and Reconciliation report, with like
mhm,
94 recommendations, very extensive, where the government says they accept all of those recommendations, and now they need to, implement those. Um, that injustice has to be, addressed in a very significant way, and I feel that most Canadians uh, don't really appreciate fully the extent of the discrimination and the treatment
mhm,
historically and
mhm,
today, and the legacy of the treatment today. Um, those who are not in that space, I think the majority of the Canadians would not be in that space, and so they wouldn't understand.
mhm.
Here's what I would say. Uh, I think we all accept the history that there's colonization. Although this was shocking. I mean, in 2000 and 2009,
Okay.
while he was Prime Minister Stephen Harper,
Mhm,
he made the following statement.
mhm,
And this is after, in terms of, I think it was just a year before that, 2008, in terms of the Indian residential school settlement agreement.
yep.
One of the things was an apology. And so
Yes.
he stated an apology in the parliament, if you could recall that.
Yep.
So about a year later, this is what he's quoted to have said. Uh, we are one of the most stable regimes in history. There are very few countries that can say for nearly 150 years they've had the same political system without any social breakdown, political upheaval, or invasion. We are unique in that regard. We also have no history of colonialism.
He said this?
Prime Minister Stephen Harper is quoted to have said that in 2009.
Mm.
right? That's a quote there, and there are some other quotes as well, but not from him, but other quotes. But that's a quote that is used by my colleague in the training that we presently doing,
Mm.
for the federal public service. Sorry, the federal public prosecutors, I should say.
Mm.
Um, so. Yeah, I mean it's crazy, uh, that type of statement, So to answer your question, coming back to your question, I don't think Canadians understand the significance of the issue because that resolution is a resolution for all Canadians, not just
Mm.
Indigenous peoples, right? Um, I teach this, train, previously at DOJ, but now I do some consultancy work, and a lot of Canadians don't know how important these Indigenous rights are in terms of the treaties that Canada has not honored now for
Mhm.
decades and decades and decades, and it's coming back to bite them in a big way.
Mhm.
Canadians don't know that the government is having to spend billions and billions of dollars in most of the Section 35 cases. When I say Section 35, for those who are not lawyers, of course, or deal with this issue, Section 35 of the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, talks about uh, recognizing the existing rights of Indigenous peoples and their treaties. Indigenous peoples have won major Section 35 cases, showing that the government of Canada has not honored the treaties.
Mhm.
Just a few months ago, the Robinson Euro Treaty, goes back a long time, hundreds of, well, not hundred, uh, at least a century and a half, um, where annuities had to be paid to Indigenous peoples in Ontario for
Mhm.
the land and the resources that were there. They were
Mm.
Canada never adhered to honor that treaty. So litigation. Fast forward, they came to a settlement in the summer of 2023, where the Ontario government is having to pay $10 billion, and the federal government another $10 billion. Canadians may see the headlines sometimes, but they don't understand that there are many significant cases being won by
Mhm.
Indigenous peoples in terms of establishing their rights. And they don't understand that Indigenous peoples don't really want they're not saying, get out of our land.
Mm.
Everybody understands we are all here to stay,
Mhm.
but they want a shared treatment in terms of what the deal was. The deal was basically, you're welcome. Let us share. Let us live together. You won't interfere with us. We won't interfere with you,
Mhm.
but you're welcome. But Canadians, unfortunately, the government of the day didn't, and of course, the legacy of all of that,
Yeah.
Indian residential schools, and all of that stuff goes on. So I think that to me is the fundamental pressing issue that Canadians are not completely fully aware of.
I think of another big gap too is with newcomers, in that I don't know if newcomers have a good understanding of,
Yeah.
how we like the truth and reconciliation of Indigenous peoples, issues of injustice around Indigenous peoples. I think that's a major gap, and obviously our population has grown so much over the last even couple of years. Um, that's my perception of that, but would you agree with that, that there is a gap there as far as how we, raise awareness to newcomers and help them understand these issues and that
Yeah.
sort of thing?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, not only newcomers, but all Canadians, but especially newcomers, they don't necessarily, have studied this or know
Mhm.
about this. I certainly didn't know, the extent to which,
Yeah.
the problem existed until, I delved into it. But, there's hope, Rupesh. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I have a 6-year-old son now, but last year he was 5 years old. He was in senior kindergarten, and he wore an orange T-shirt to school.
Mm.
And I asked him, I mean, I knew, but I was asking him, what happened? Why are you wearing an orange T-shirt today?
Mhm.
he calls me Papa.
Mm.
So he says, Papa, it's a special day today. So I said to him, what's the special day? He said, a long time ago, children were not treated well, and some of them never came back home. That is why it's a special day. Now, that's a 5-year old, right?
Mhm.
And he's learning about these things, in kindergarten, you know. So that gives me hope that things are turning around
Yeah.
slowly, slowly. But that's where we got to start, right? With these toddlers, and hopefully, as they grow up, they'll know more. And with information available now, it can't be kept a secret like it used to be. It
No.
was a secret.
No, 100%. And you know what? I think schools and communities are doing a really good job with that. Like even my daughter, she's sounds like the same age as your son there, and they have Orange Shirt
Grandson.
Day and oh, grandson, sorry,
Yeah.
they're she participates fully and she has some level of understanding of what it's about, and they have on TRC Day here in Edmonton their events, and we try to attend these things, and I think these things do make a difference, and they definitely give some hope to the overall
Yeah.
situation for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, when you were that age and when you went to school, yeah, right.
Yeah.
I take it that you were not exposed to that.
Oh no, 100%. I would say, Prakash, honestly, I probably didn't fully understand the residential school situation until maybe the mid to late 2010s, to be honest. Like
Yeah,
fully started to get a really good grasp of it. I started to become aware of it probably in the early to mid 2000s, but in terms of actually internalizing it, taking the time to really understand what happened, it wasn't really until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission got going and I started to, you know, take the time to understand it. And then, of course, like being as part, having worked in the public service, you know, you get indigenous awareness training and there's more and more conversations about it, and that makes a difference too. But as part of my schooling, the history that we were taught was all about colonial history and nothing about indigenous history, like at all.
yeah,
Yeah. So
sure.
yeah, definitely,
Yeah,
definitely,
there you
definitely
go.
a big gap there. Yeah, for sure. And so I'm curious to see with my daughter when they start learning about history, what has changed. I would hope that the curriculums haven't been modified and have started to change. I don't know. Do you have any window into that as far as whether curriculums have changed on this front?
I think they have. I mean, I don't know the details, but that's one of the recommendations of the TRC.
Yeah.
To have this training and teaching at all levels, including the schools,
Yeah.
right? Including law societies and public service and yeah. So no, I have reason to believe that. I don't know to what extent, but yeah, I know it definitely has changed.
Yeah. I wanna now focus, if you're okay with, on your time in South Africa, and then sort of as you kind of came here, if that works for you. Um,
Absolutely, I'm in your hands. Shoot.
we spoke about this a few months ago when we first connected. Really curious about your time in South Africa and what life was like during the apartheid period, because I think I may have mentioned that my dad also lived in South Africa for many years, but it was a topic that we never really dove into, and I would say he was very quiet about it. And he
Mhm.
kind of told me about, like, there's a lot of separation, but I don't know if he didn't really express anything, and I don't know if there was trauma there or if there was he just wasn't so active about it and thinking about it so much. I'm not sure, honestly. I really don't know why we didn't talk about it as much as we should have, I think. But
Yeah.
yeah, so there's a space there personally where I'd like to kind of explore what life was like there. But yeah, I don't think the everyday person understands what life was like during apartheid time in Africa, South Africa. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right, and that's my experience. In talking to people. Yeah, they sort of broadly understand apartheid, but they didn't understand on a day-to-day basis what it really meant. Um, so I'm at least a third generation of Indian descent that was born. My parents were also born in South Africa,
Mm,
and so the maybe I start off by saying very simply, there were basically four distinct racial groups in South Africa, uh, and based on that racial categorization, uh, you enjoyed power or you didn't enjoy power and
Mhm.
privilege. So right at the top of the, I don't know what you call it, the ladder maybe, of hierarchy, I should say, you would have the white population, as I said, was less than 10% of
Mhm.
the population. So a very distant second, or maybe even I go there. Only whites had the right to vote. Only whites had the economic power, military power, everything. Only to the whites, right?
Mhm.
Very distant second, you would have the colored group, and the colored was the mixed race group between the
Okay.
black and the white, right? And they, at best, they were about 3 million, but and a very distant, sorry, a very close third were people of what we call Asians or Indians,
Mhm.
where we were the third. But the very distant last, even from the third to the fourth, very big gap was the so-called blacks, or we call them Africans,
Mhm.
because at a certain time in the history of South Africa, in the struggle for freedom, the coloreds, Indians, and Africans, we considered ourselves black because we were not white and we had no rights like whites had. So, but Africans are the, and I'll refer to them as blacks because most people understand them as blacks, right? The biggest population, the most disadvantaged, the most discriminated against in every aspect of what you can think about. And let me explain what I mean. You had separate residential areas called the Group Areas Act. So every racial group had to live in a separate group area. Whites took over 80% of the land. They deprived everybody of the land, right? 87% of the land was, for whites.
Mhm.
And it was a criminal offense for one racial group to be living in another area of a racial group of another area. You were contravening the Group Areas Act, which was a criminal offense. And then you had you had the Prohibition Against the Mixed Marriages Act. That was the name of the law.
Wow.
The
Wow.
Prohibition Against the Mixed Marriages Act. The act
Couldn't get any
name
clearer,
speaks
right?
for itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But in addition to that, Rupesh, they have the Immorality Act. The Immorality Act is not just not marrying somebody of a different race, but having any relationship, uh, a sexual relationship in particular, you would be contravening the Immorality Act and you would be prosecuted and jailed. So those were the big, and then big party. Of course,
Mhm.
because we lived in different areas, racialized areas,
Mhm.
our schools were segregated as well. So we only went to schools designated for your particular racial group, right?
Mhm.
And the amount of money spent on the education of a white child was at least more than 10 times the education spent on the education on a colored or Indian child,
Wow.
and pennies for an African child,
Mhm. Mhm.
because it was a stated policy of the government that the blacks were not to be educated because they were meant to be slaves to their white masters.
Mhm.
This was said in Parliament, right?
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
mean, I mean that was so blatant. So the Constitution was, in such a way that it was racial discrimination,
Mhm.
and every other law on the books. But one of the most offending pieces of legislation for Africans, especially, was what they call the pass laws, PASS laws,
Okay.
pass laws. It prohibited them from moving from one area to another area without a permit. Now, by the way, the Indian residential schools system, or the Indian Act rather, although it didn't have the pass laws, it had the practice of pass laws. And in a similar way, Indians, sorry, I should say indigenous peoples,
Yes.
although the Act talks about Indians,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to confuse, right? They were not allowed to leave the reserves without special permission.
Mhm.
In a similar way, the South Africans actually borrowed the Indian Act in establishing the apartheid system.
Okay.
And so the past laws was such an egregious piece of legislation that people were banished. Well, let me also back up to say there were so-called homelands or reserves created in remote parts of the country for different tribes of the African tribes.
Mhm.
Zulus in Zululand, for
Mm.
example, right? And so that's where they were banished to, but their males were required as laborers, so they had to come, as laborers to the cities.
Sure.
But their families were, of course, separated. And so, if their families wanted to visit them or come and see them, they
Hmm.
were breaking the law and they were jailed.
Mm.
Millions of people were
Wow.
criminalized.
Yeah.
Millions and millions of people were criminalized. Sometimes just looking for a job in a different area than what they were supposed to be. In 1960, March the 21st, 1960, there was a peaceful civil disobedience organized in a place called Sharpeville.
Hmm.
That's a township, in fact, where my clients came from,
Hmm.
Sharpeville. It's a black township, about 60 kilometers south of Johannesburg.
Okay.
They arranged a peaceful protest and a civil disobedience for the passes. They were going to have a bonfire and burn their passes. Police lost their heads. Although this was peaceful, unarmed crowd,
Hmm.
they shot into the crowd. They massacred people. 69 people were massacred on the spot. Subsequent reports of autopsies showed that most of them were shot in the back. Hundreds were injured. And there was a world outcry about that. And the isolation of South Africa started slowly. The boycott of South Africa, kicked out of the Commonwealth of
Mm.
Nations, and other boycotts that followed over the decades, to the extent, of course, that in 1994, Mandela became the first democratic elected president.
Hmm.
So growing up in South Africa was difficult because we didn't
Mm.
have all the amenities. We did the best we could, with the resources that we had. But I can only speak mostly for the Indian community and my parents and my family. They were not people of means. My father worked very hard. He was a very bright student at school, but never got the opportunity to advance himself. So he had to leave at standard six,
Mm.
which is now grade eight
Hmm.
equivalent. My mom, even I think grade three, she had to leave. Both very bright. So my parents, did their very best to give their kids an education, and I was the first person in my family to be able to go to university, and that was because of my parents' sacrifice. When I say sacrifice, I mean,
Yeah.
let me just explain that very briefly. My
Absolutely.
father worked in a factory. Gone from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., right? So we're very fortunate. My father got what they call a dairy, a depot, where we sold milk and other dairy products
Hmm.
during the day. So my mother would run the dairy depot from while my dad was gone to work. So my dad was delivering in those days. You would deliver milk door to door. So my dad started his rounds of delivery before he would go to his job at 7 a.m. to the factory. And so his rounds became bigger, his delivery rounds for milk delivery. Those days we had glass bottles and you would deliver door to door.
Yep. Yep.
My father's rounds became bigger and bigger, and hence he had to start his deliveries earlier and earlier, 3 o'clock,
Oh
four
God.
o'clock, two
Yeah.
o'clock,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
1 o'clock, right? And then he would finish his rounds and then go to work, come back. And then his body couldn't take it any longer. And the doctor said, listen, either the one or the other you have to give up because otherwise you're not going to
Hmm.
last long.
Hmm.
And so through that sacrifice, I got the opportunity to go to university. And I was one of the first few lawyers in my community there, having to service the community from every branch of the law, from wills and estates to personal injuries, to landlord and tenant issues, to criminal, to you name it. We had to quickly learn every area of the law and practice every area of the law. But of course, the human rights part of it took precedence because
Mm.
almost everything was criminalized,
Yeah.
and people needed a present. So I don't know if I can tell you more, but we were even discriminated against from moving. We couldn't go to the same restaurants.
Mm.
We couldn't go to the same swimming pools, to the same parks.
Hmm.
Or sometimes, if you could go to the same park, the benches were separated or the
Right.
areas were separated. Our beaches were separated. Beaches only for whites, separated from beaches only for coloreds, separated only for beaches for Indians,
Right.
and beaches for Africans. I mean, Um, Cinemas were, separate and unequal as well. Everything was separate and unequal. I mean, that was apartheid in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I've so much I want to say to this. First of all, the
Yeah,
Sharpeville situation. I think it's commonly known as the Sharpeville massacre, right? Is that from the
correct.
'60s? I think, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
What a
yeah.
horrendous.
Anybody, any of your listeners who are interested, they can just Google Sharpeville Massacre
Yeah.
1960. They will find it.
Yeah. Just hearing you talk about your parents and your parents' sacrifice, whenever I hear about that sort of thing, even I get a little bit sort of emotional inside to kind of hear about like the sacrifice that people had to make for their kids in that sort of situation. I imagine it's had a huge impression on you, right? Just in terms of that sacrifice that they made.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And not only that, we lived in extended families and communities, and
Hmm.
everybody cared for each other. There's a beautiful saying in the African language called Ubuntu. It's
Mm.
Ubuntu. Ubuntu, very simply said, is I am because of you, and you because of humanity, right?
Yeah.
You don't exist on your own. We part of each other,
Yeah.
and that spirit, and it goes back, and I tried to learn this, after the fact. Unfortunately, while I was growing up, I wasn't interested in
Hmm.
finding out the true history of the lineage of your family and where they came from and how
Mm.
they came, and so forth. But the sacrifice is something very common, yeah, amongst all the populations. I don't know so much about the whites. Of course, they were the most privileged, so
Hmm.
perhaps not so much. But even the Africans, the sacrifice that they made, like, as poor as they were, because the policy of the government was not to give them even any reading material, writing material, pencils at school. They in uniforms, we all had to wear uniforms, and uniforms were expensive, and they had to do all of that on their own. And yet you would see them, trying their very best to sacrifice. Now, our families came, from India. Of some came as indentured laborers, others came a little later.
Hmm.
But the sacrifice, and there's a history of that. They were treated like slaves.
Yeah.
Essentially,
Yeah.
the indentured laborers. And so there's I mean, the sacrifice and the courage that they had, to make it possible for us to have better lives. Even in apartheid South Africa. I mean, uh, when I went to university and qualified, I wasn't wealthy, but I was living okay. I
Yeah.
could,
Mm.
I had a car, my wife had a car. We didn't have land, or we didn't have a house,
Hmm.
so we lived in what we call a flat, or an apartment, as they call it here in North America. But we lived okay. We could afford decent things. But it is all possible because of our ancestors
Yeah.
and the sacrifice that they made. And so I just mentioned that a little bit, sacrifice, because sometimes people don't understand. Oh yeah, okay, they must have sacrificed, but what
Hmm.
did it really mean?
Yeah.
My grandparents, for example, right? My maternal grandparents,
Hmm.
who we were very close to, growing up, both not educated in English,
Hmm.
came as toddlers from India, and so they would sell toiletries at a railway station, and they had the push cart with wheels, trolley,
Hmm.
we used to call it,
Hmm.
a big trolley, right?
Yep. Yep.
um, and they would load it up in the morning with toiletries, push it all the way by hand to the railway station, and stand the whole day there selling candles and all sorts of other things that passengers would need on a daily basis.
Hmm.
And then in the evening come back, after the day's work. And they went on, and my mama, which is my mother's brother, uh, you know he they sacrificed for him so that he could go to college and become a teacher.
Hmm.
you know and that's the type of sacrifice that people made. And
Yeah.
my example is only one example. The same can be said for so many other families, as I said.
Yeah, and I would like I have something similar in my family history of those kind of similar sacrifices of in order to educate, whether it be the oldest son or whatever, so that the family can kind of move forward and make progress. And
Yeah.
unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
um i
Sure.
want to I want to very quickly just share my screen here, because um one of the most famous cases that seems like you focused on was the Sharpeville Six. And without getting
Yeah.
into too much depth on this, because people can certainly read into it, you wrote a book on
Sure.
it, and you kind of do this. You're sort of the storyteller on this one. This is
Hmm.
six people who were found guilty of murdering, I think, a deputy mayor, I believe,
Black deputy mayor. Yeah.
yes, and then they're found guilty. They were going to be sentenced to death. I think they're for many many years they were kind of told, like, hey, you're going to be hung, you're going to be
Executed.
hung, and
Yeah.
just imagine the trauma from that. And then you were
Yeah.
the defense attorney, or the lead defense attorney on that. What
Hmm.
from this
Correct.
story do you want the young people from today to kind of take away from this?
Oh man, never give up. Just never give up. For the fight for justice. They were wrongly convicted and sentenced to death. In terms of the law,
Hmm.
they were sacrificed by the apartheid white government to make an example of people. Although the trial judge found that not one of the six had committed the act of murder, nonetheless, each one was sentenced to death, and which was unheard of in terms of even the own apartheid South African legal precedents. They went completely against all precedents. They perverted the law, just to make an example of these six. And although I had lost, at every level of the court, including the highest equivalent of the Supreme Court of Canada in South Africa,
Hmm.
where I thought that they would intervene at least on the sentencing part, because there were so many extenuating circumstances. And the death sentence was only meted out in the most extreme cases.
Hmm.
We lost. The petition to the state president, who has the right uh, to grant clemency in certain cases based on the law, as well as on humanitarian basis
Hmm.
or on political basis, he refused. It was P.W. Botha at the time. And the lesson I took away is, although I lost at every level, at the highest level, I never gave up, because I believed in the justice of the case for the six.
Hmm.
I mobilized local organizations, communities, churches, student groups, women's groups, you name it. And I muscled the support of the international community, so much so that even countries that were pro apartheid South Africa, in particular the United Kingdom,
Hmm.
Margaret Thatcher at the time, the United States, Ronald Reagan at the time,
Hmm.
and Germany at the time, Chancellor Kohl. I targeted those three in particular to reach out to them on legal and humanitarian basis to intervene personally, and which they did.
Hmm.
And we were in court. My clients were going to be executed on a Friday morning, March the 18th, 1988. Well, literally within hours the previous afternoon, we are in court asking for a stay of execution based on a legal technicality. And we won a temporary stay of execution.
Hmm.
And then the political pressure was mounted, as I talked about, international pressure. And fortunately, their sentences were commuted to very lengthy jail terms. And I was
Hmm.
still unhappy because I thought they were unjustly treated. And therefore, I wanted to document something. And that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Amazing. I went through these pictures. Look at you over there. Look at
A lot of hair
yeah,
at the
yeah.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
How
That
old would
picture
you
actually, that picture was taken at the United Nations
okay.
General Assembly. I was testifying before the United Nations General
Wow.
Assembly about the six and about atrocities in South Africa.
Yeah.
You can't see but you can see a tag hanging on my jacket lapel.
Okay.
That's actually at the United Nations. Yeah.
Amazing. And then there's a picture of here with your hero Mandela. Tell
Yeah.
tell
Yeah.
tell us about maybe this encounter, or like did you get to interact with him at all, and what was he like, I guess, very quickly.
Very, yeah, very little. I knew Winnie Mandela better than him, of course. My law firm in where I used to practice in South Africa, we represented the Mandela family.
Mm,
But he was in jail most of those years, as you know.
mm-hmm,
So I knew Winnie well, and I knew I represented her once actually when my senior partner was out of the country. This encounter was soon after his release, actually, not too long after his release. Interestingly enough, Canada was one of the first countries he visited after his release,
mm,
and he acknowledged the Canadians' contributions to the fight, to the anti-apartheid struggle, and he recognized that. And this was a meeting in his hotel room, actually, in Toronto. And Winnie, of course, knew me, and she made it happen. And the encounter wasn't lengthy, just very brief. I mean, he had
yeah.
the world, wanting him at that time.
Yes.
And so this was in Toronto, yeah. And I just by I just noticing, and I think I have a picture with him, but I have a beautiful blurb there by Archbishop Desmond Tutu
Mm-hmm.
and Nadine Gordimer, and those two, as well as Mandela, of course, are all Nobel laureates. Just happened that they all know. Yeah. So yeah, it was a privilege and an honor for me, and he knew, of course, me. And it was wonderful, just yeah, to be acknowledged by him for the work that I had done.
Amazing. Prakash, I want to end on a one more topic. It's kind of hard to make it quick on this one, but a big injustice that's happening right now is in Israel and the Palestinian conflict. I know there was a webinar you kind of did recently on this one, but like, what's going through your mind right now as you see this conflict? Um, yeah, I don't know. Is there anything that you want people to think about on this one?
Uh, yeah, yeah. Just very quickly, again, do you mind if I just go back to the book that you just showed before I
Absolutely.
answer
Yeah.
your question?
Yes.
If you're going to be rounding off with this question,
Sure.
because I wrote the book because I felt the injustice and so forth and so forth. And just to fast forward, after this was published in 1990, right? And just to fast forward all this, my book has been adapted into a full feature movie. And not just the movie, the book itself, because the focus of the story is actually a little different from the book, because I don't tell my story.
Mm-hmm.
I was arrested for exposing the injustice of the
Mm-hmm.
apartheid system. I was arrested without charge. I was detained. I was kept in solitary confinement. I was tortured. And they tried to falsely implicate me with false charges of treason, which fortunately didn't work. They said I had illegal arms and ammo in my apartment, and they tried to plant that. But fortunately, while I was in detention, fortunately, my family and extended family prevented that from happening, because they suspected. So the police had arrived in the pretext of a search, but they wanted to plant something, and so fortunately that didn't happen. So none of that is in the book, because I didn't want to take away focus from the six, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the movie is going to be my character and my wife's character are going to be the central characters of basically essentially a David versus Goliath story, where a small young lawyer takes on this mighty machinery of the apartheid regime, and the price him and his family has to pay for this. So I just wanted to mention that we are at a very advanced stage.
Yeah.
Very blessed that all the pieces are falling into place, and if
Yeah.
all goes well, we hope to shoot in this year, 2014, and hope to complete the shooting of the movie this year.
Do you think you'll
But
be a
that's if all the pieces.
do
Yeah,
you
sorry,
do
go
you
ahead.
think you'll be a part of it in like in terms of actually being on screen, or what's your sense of that?
In terms of being on the screen, I don't know, but I don't know about a cameo or anything
Yeah.
of that sort.
Yeah.
But they need a younger version of me, of course, to be playing my role, right? But I am one of the producers. I will be a consultant, hopefully on the set as well. So I'll be actively involved in that. But me being on the screen itself is a question mark. I don't know. We've
Yeah.
never talked about it.
What
But
a neat
who
experience,
knows?
and I'm so glad that
Yeah.
I'll be looking forward to seeing that for sure, and I hope people tune into that. That's
Yeah, no,
incredible.
no, I
Yeah.
will definitely want to publicize it as widely as
Yes.
possible when it happens.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Uh,
So,
yeah. Go
so
ahead.
coming back to your question, right?
Yeah.
It's a very broad question, which I
Yeah.
like because I can just hone into because
Sure.
there's a lot of history to that, right?
Yeah.
I think I alluded to this earlier in my our conversation, where I believe in the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in human rights.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in international humanitarian law, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the starting premise for me, right? Uh, and what I heard, a young lawyer, a young black lawyer, based in Ottawa, reached out to me and talked to me about the concern about some law students, some young lawyers being threatened, in terms of their job opportunities. And I thought that, as a legal profession, that was wrong, where people need to start seeking justice and the rule of law. So that's why I organized, the session where I had some wonderful experts on it. But let's fast forward that because I wanted to show and have a platform for young lawyers or non lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
because even doctors are being affected by this, even other people are being affected.
Mm.
It appears that only those who are pro Palestinian are being more ostracized and
Mm.
threatened than anybody else. So that's why we had the forum to let people know what is the law, what is the rule of law, and what is expected. And you're not alone in this. That's the message I wanted to give.
Mm-hmm.
So coming back to the situation now, the Palestine-Israeli issue, I couldn't be more proud of the South Africans for having filed this case against
Mm.
Israel before the ICJ, International, Court of Justice.
Especially just given all the
Uh,
history that you just walked me through, right? Like,
exactly,
yeah. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But not only that, Rupesh, they have filed a brilliant brief, a brilliant petition application before the court.
Mm.
It's a masterpiece, and I don't say that for myself only. Experts around the world are saying that,
Mm.
and when I say that, or what do I mean that by the experts? I'm talking about Professor Raz Siegel. He's Israeli. He's got a unique expertise because he's a historian. He's an expert on the Holocaust
Mm.
as well as an expert on genocide.
Mm.
And he has said, and he got 55 other world experts to issue a statement to that effect as well. I talk about a guy by the name of Professor Francis Boyle, Boyle.
Mm.
Francis Boyle is British, and he was the first lawyer to win an interim order at the ICJ on genocide. And what he studied the papers and he listened to the application, as well as the rebuttal by. And this is what he said. He said, uh, "It's a solid case. It's an airtight case because of the intention, that's been proclaimed by so many senior government officials, from
Mm.
the prime minister to the president to the minister of defense and onwards."
Mm-hmm.
Because there's two things that's needed here, right? The intent and the actual act of genocide to qualify as a genocide. But as you know, it's an interim order. They're not asking for a finding of genocide,
Right.
just for an interim finding, a plausible finding that the actions are characteristics of genocidal acts. Right?
Mm.
So they file a solid case. The defense, according to the experts again, was very weak, in legally speaking and factually speaking. What I find interesting is Canada's position in all of this. And Canada's position, previously starting, they said no ceasefire, continue the massacre, no ceasefire, because Israel's got the right to self-defense. Right? And that has been shown to be not true, because they don't have the right to self-defense in international law as found by the ICJ way back in 2004, because they are
Okay.
an occupying territory, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
They
Okay.
it's not like Russia and Ukraine.
Mm.
Israel is an occupying territory, which changes the dynamics,
Mm.
and this went to on a separate issue, but it went to the ICJ, and they found no, Israel, you don't have the right to self-defense.
Mhm.
You are an occupying territory, right? So anyway, I won't go into the nitty-gritty of this, right? All this to say that Canada have moved slightly from the right to self-defense to say, okay, no, Israel, you got to apply international humanitarian law in your response, right? But they were still to some extent supporting. But it's recently, I think they've moved even a little further from that, where they say, we will accept the ruling of the ICJ. But what your audience need to know is this: the South Africans filed their case before the ICJ on the 29th of December, 2023.
Mhm.
A few weeks before that, right? Canada filed, and Canada has been very active in the International Court of Justice on genocide issues. And Canada, together jointly, it was Canada, it was the United Kingdom, it was the Netherlands, it was Germany, and I believe
Mhm.
Denmark. So 6 countries jointly filed a intervener
Mhm.
in support of the finding of genocide in the Myanmar case that was brought to by the country of Gambia.
Mm.
What is interesting when I looked at that application as joinder intervener was so interesting because they are arguing for an extended definition of genocide, especially as it relates to children, right? Which supports the case of South Africa to the hilt.
Mm.
The second thing they say, I mean, I'm just summarizing the two main points I want
Yeah.
to make, is that they're asking for a broader definition as it relates to children because the effects on children are so much different, long term and so forth. But the second thing they talk about is the intent requirement as an essential element for the crime of genocide. They are saying the court should apply a more broader definition. They should not make it such a high standard as it to make it impossible to prove the crime of genocide, right? So they're asking for a broader definition for the intent part. In the Israeli case, South Africa versus Israel,
Mhm.
you have I mean, South Africans did a really good job in enumerating all the intent espoused by them. But in my humble opinion, even if they didn't say a single word, the actions are so gross on the ground
Mhm.
because the courts, as you know, intent is very rarely pronounced. So you take the indirect evidence, circumstantial evidence to make the inference that there was an intent,
Mhm.
right? So in that case, you have both. So I think it's going to be interesting because what is also interesting is the same judges, essentially, some of them are retiring at the end of this month,
Mhm.
but essentially the same judges made a ruling not too long ago, maybe 3 years ago, 2 years, 3 years ago, we're in 2024 now, on the Myanmar case.
Mhm.
In my respectful view, was a much weaker case before them than what the South Africans brought.
Okay.
And they gave the interim order, right?
Mm.
So I'll see how they would want to distinguish themselves if they don't.
Yeah.
It's politics at plays, at the highest levels.
Yeah.
A lot of political pressure being applied, so who knows? But those are my brief overview, comments that the rule of law applies to every country.
Yes.
There should be no exceptions. Even though fact that and what is heartening to me is that many these are Jewish scholars. There's William Shabazz, Professor William Shabazz, who's a Canadian,
Mhm.
world expert on this topic as well, and he said uh, he would be stunned because he's appeared before that court as well.
Yeah.
He would be stunned if the South Africans don't win an interim
Mm.
order. So anyway, I'm not an expert in this field, but I go by what the experts say, and I look at objectively as I can, the case that has been brought, and so that's where I am. No country should be excluded, not the United States, not Canada, not the United Kingdom. Why should the global north be excluded from a finding?
Sure.
And earlier I said it doesn't matter who the perpetrator
Yep.
is. The
Yep.
rule of law requires, that there be equitable treatment. So it'll be interesting to see.
What teeth does the ICJ actually have? Like what with the rulings? Like do states and
Yeah,
countries have to follow the ICJ in any way or
good question. Really good question. They just make the order like any other court, right? They,
okay.
they, they don't enforce. They don't have an enforcement mechanism. It's
Yep.
the United Nations Security Council that they'll have to come to,
Okay.
and the Security Council, according to what has been the history. Uh, the United States has protected Israel at every level. They've vetoed every resolution that you can think of. But if that happens, it is my understanding that it then goes to the General Assembly.
Mm,
And I have no reason to believe that the General Assembly will overwhelmingly, abide by the ruling and
mm,
hopefully enforce in some respects. What's interesting is, uh, what's it, France, as well as now, I just saw, was it yesterday or the day before, the Canadian government says they will abide by the ruling of the ICJ.
mm,
What does that mean?
mm.
Does that mean they will help enforce the order? That's what I would think, right?
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting, right?
Yep.
But this the way it's played out, it's exposing the different worldviews from the global South majority world to the global North and the Western countries, and I
Yep.
think they're going to be exposed for their double standards and their hypocrisy.
Prakash, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm completely humbled by yeah, just your availability and presence on my show. Just understanding your story and your insights on some really important topics. Thank you so much for making time. I'm so excited to see whatever comes out of this film, and you're welcome anytime to come back. I would love to have you when that film comes out and we can dive more into your story than we did today. But really, thank you so much for making time for me today. I know the listeners and the viewers are going to get so much out of this. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, just appreciate you so much.
No, thank you for the invitation, and it's my honor and pleasure to contribute in the small way that I can. And if I may say this, I thank you for taking the time to give me a platform, and commend you for having this podcast. And you have been nothing but a true professional from the start to the end. In the way you have prepared this, and the questions that you asked were so relevant, to the point, and really well done. And it's my pleasure actually to have been with you on, as I said at the start, two nobodies, getting together. But I truly mean that, and I hope that you will be able to get a vast viewership of what you are planning to do. And I don't know the details, but I was happy to talk to you about it. And I can't be more happier than talking to somebody like you, in the way
Mm.
you have prepared this and the way you presented it. And I felt it was such a free flowing discussion and questions. It was really well done. Kudos to you.
My goodness, thank you. That means a great deal, Prakash. Um, yeah, I hope to see you in the future for sure. Thank you, Prakash.
Definitely.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for joining today. Really appreciate you listening to this episode. Like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks. Take care. Bye.